During the night of November 9th, 1917, Bolshevik revolutionaries, with the assistance of sympathetic Russian army soldiers, fanned out across the city of St. Petersburg. Under the cover of darkness, the Bolsheviks, or members of the Russian Social Democratic Party, occupied key points of the Baltic port city, which had been the imperial capital of the Russian Empire for the past 200 years. They took over the railroad stations, the post offices, the telephone and telegraph exchanges, the power stations, and the national banks. This stealthy seizure of power, called the October Revolution, because Russia was still using the old-style Julian calendar at the time, occurred overnight and with virtually no bloodshed. Now, this wasn't the start of the Russian Revolution. That had begun months before, in February 1917. But it was the defining phase of the movement, the phase led by Vladimir Lenin, an intellectual activist who had returned to his Russian homeland only a few weeks before the Bolsheviks seized the city. Who was Lenin? Well, he was born into a wealthy middle-class family. His father, Ilya, descended from serfs, but had the advantage of a university education and went on to become an educator. Ilya died when Vladimir was just 16 years old. His older brother Alexander had become involved in radical politics while at university and was arrested and hanged in a plot to assassinate the Tsar. Vladimir was very much influenced by these tragedies in his life, and perhaps even more influenced by his brother's radical politics. Vladimir became so involved with radical groups that he was exiled to Siberia for several years and finally left Russia for Western Europe, where he became involved with radical socialist movements at an international level. So, what role did he have to play in the Russian Revolution? When World War I began, only 3 years earlier, Vladimir Lenin had been in Galicia, a part of the Austrian Empire that's now in the Ukraine on the border with Poland. As a Russian citizen, he was jailed until he was able to prove to local authorities that he was anti-Tsarist. You see, Russia and Austria-Hungary were rivals and on the opposite sides in the First World War. After his release, Lenin fled to Switzerland, where he spent most of the war years agitating and encouraging socialists to transform the conflict into a workers' revolt. In February of 1917, workers in St. Petersburg struck over food shortages and poor factory conditions. Tsar Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, putting Russian government in the hands of the Duma, or assembly. Seeing a chance to take leadership of the Bolsheviks, Lenin looked for ways to get back to Russia. But how? Well, Lenin and his associates in Switzerland opened negotiations with the German military to secure transport across Germany. The only reason they got the Germans to entertain the notion was by convincing them that Lenin and his followers could cause a lot of trouble for the Russian authorities and perhaps get Russia to exit the war. And actually, getting Russia out of the war was just one of Lenin's goals. Bringing down the Tsar's government was his real objective. So thanks to the German military, Lenin and his supporters traveled by train across Germany to the port town of Sassnitz on the Baltic Sea. And from there, after taking a ferry to Sweden, they were able to cross into Russia through Finland. Lenin arrived in St. Petersburg only a few weeks before the October Revolution, and he still managed to play the lead role in putting the Bolsheviks in control. Socialist and communist parties had been agitating throughout the industrial West for decades before the First World War broke out. The socialists believe that revolution was the only way for social and economic change to come about that would be favorable to them. Now, there were many varieties of socialism, but one that became widely accepted was the ideology expounded by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels during the 1840s and 50s. Throughout most of the 19th century, the socialist parties succeeded at inciting workers to make their influence felt in the workplace through strikes and collective bargaining. But Marx wasn't simply proposing a strategy for working people to gain more control in society. He was proposing a theory about the way society develops over time. Influenced by German philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries, Marx proposed a theory of history as evolving in stages and based on the relationships humans have with one another as they seek to provide for their basic or economic needs. Though many people have assumed that Marx was proposing a kind of overarching general theory about history, all he really claimed was that his study explained what he saw as the key drivers of the European experience. Marx's theory focused on the tensions that arise over private property. This does not refer to personal possessions. A lot of people make that mistake. Rather, it refers to productive property and its profits. Property, that is, used in the production of goods. The problem, as Marx saw it, was that conflicts over property, or the means to produce wealth, within a social system resulted in the society's collapse over time and the rise of a new social system in its place. What did Marx view as the stages of development? First, primitive communism, in which all wealth is held collectively. This is the hunter-gatherer society that collapses with the advent of settled agriculture and the rise of the subsequent slave society. Actually, during this first stage, the concept of private property, as Marxists would later express it, is thought not yet to exist. Second, slave society. Marx posits that it's with this second stage that the concept of class begins. Slave society is marked by slave ownership and large-scale agriculture. The slaves produce all goods under the direction of the slave owners. Slave society supposedly continues to expand and produce more only with more and more slaves. So it eventually collapses as the slave owners can no longer bear the costs of ownership. Third, feudalism. Under feudalism, classes proliferate and labor is subordinated to the needs of the aristocracy. In feudalism, peasants were called serfs, and they were legally bound to the land, which was controlled by an extractive nobility. As Marx saw it, medieval feudalism didn't collapse until the social revolutions of the late 17th and 18th centuries broke the relationships between the serfs and the landed nobility. It is at this point that, fourth, capitalism emerges. Under capitalism, the middle class, or bourgeois class, controls the means of production rather than any governing or aristocratic authority. And the bourgeoisie seeks to maximize its profits through what we call a market economy, even at the expense of the working classes. And fifth, finally, socialism emerges, when the working classes rise up and seize the means of production, meaning the tools, factories, farms, and other productive infrastructure. These were to be collectively controlled by the workers. Well, Lenin took Marx's theory further and added a sixth stage to describe when social classes and private property presumably would disappear. Lenin suggested that mankind could live in a stateless society, meaning no government and no laws. This was the ultimate goal of communism. All very utopian, isn't it? One problem is that this was a theory of historical development transformed into a guide for social development. Well, what problems were the various theories of socialism and communism attempting to solve? Since Marxism was, at its core, a reaction to capitalism, and perhaps to Adam Smith's particularly laissez-faire concept of capitalism, most of the problems that socialists wanted to solve concerned working-class participation in the democratic process. That is, who should control production and the distribution of wealth. In other words, socialists asked the question, why should the capitalists reap all the wealth from production when it is accomplished on the backs of the workers? The socialists pointed out that an industrialist with a factory and machinery could not produce anything without the workers. So under these circumstances, why should the capitalist be able to take the lion's share of the wealth? Obviously, capitalists and the governments of the industrialized nations were threatened by this kind of rhetoric and the agitation of workers that it could cause. Since many socialists interpreted the First World War as one that was waged to prop up the capitalist system and to advance the interests of industrialists, some of them agreed not to support the war unless it took the form of a revolution to bring about social change. At the same time, many socialist parties wanted to support their nations out of a sense of patriotism. The resulting disagreement caused some socialists to reconsider Marx's teaching that socialism could not be realized until each nation went first through a bourgeois or capitalist revolution. One of those who broke with the idea was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had a clear ideological viewpoint and was dedicated to communist revolution worldwide. But he was torn about the success of the revolution in Russia. Initially, Lenin did not see a communist revolution in Russia as the goal or even the most important aspect of the overall goal. For Lenin, the Russian Revolution was meant only to be a spark for revolution in industrialized Germany or any other truly industrialized country. And Germany was the most obvious prospect at the end of World War I. Lenin once wrote, "If it were necessary for the Russian Bolsheviks to go under to assure the success of the German Revolution, we should have to do it. The German Revolution is vastly more important than ours." Well, what German Revolution was he talking about? Well, in 1918, after the end of World War I, a revolution of sorts began in Germany that was led by the Social Democrats, who'd been gaining power in Germany as World War I dragged on. Chaos ensued as socialists and conservatives fought for control. But the socialists were not united in Germany. While many of them wanted a government of workers' councils, most Social Democrats preferred a parliamentary system of government. So the Social Democrats left the revolution, which was already falling apart, allowing government troops to crush it. The more radical revolutionaries in Germany had expected Russia to come to the rescue, but Lenin had bigger problems to deal with once the Russian Tsarist regime fell from power. Although the Russian economy was becoming modern by the time the First World War began, its pace of change was downright glacial. Growth was far slower than that of the Western nations, and about on par with the slowly developing economies of Latin America and Asia. There were some significant structural problems that could not be overcome because of the Tsarist regime's inability to mediate between the peasants who'd been released from serfdom in 1861 and the nobility's insistence on being compensated for the loss of its serfs. Russia did have an emerging industrial manufacturing sector, but with restrictions on peasant relocation, the potential to increase the industrial labor force through urban migration was low. Because of the Tsarist regime's inability to solve deep structural problems in the Russian economy, it had come under fire for almost a decade before World War I. In 1905, Russian peasants and disgruntled factory workers began a series of strikes and eventually armed insurrection. In order to stay in power, Tsar Nicholas agreed to allow the creation of the Duma, Legislative Assembly, and greater freedoms for Russians. But these concessions really only delayed the end of Nicholas's rule. Tensions mounted during World War I due to Russia's inability to counter German advances. The Tsar decided to take personal control of the Russian army and moved to the front lines. The problem was that in an autocratic regime, this left nobody in charge back at the capital, except for Nicholas's German wife, Alexandra. Alexandra came under the influence of a charismatic religious mystic named Rasputin. Under Rasputin's influence, the Tsarina and her advisors made a mess of government. Yet he retained his influence in part because he supposedly could control the bleeding of the Crown Prince Alexis, who was a hemophiliac. At the same time, Alexandra was very unpopular because she was German, and many people assumed she was under German influence. As a result, there was little confidence in the imperial government by 1916. Nobles trying to save the government from German influence assassinated Rasputin in December 1916. But by then, it really made no difference. Russia was moving toward revolution amid the Tsar's neglect, rapid industrialization, no meaningful land reform, and a horrible and unpopular war over issues in the Balkans and Europe that had nothing to do with the lives of most Russians. St. Petersburg had been renamed Petrograd because it sounded less German. When a series of strikes broke out in the city in February 1917, the government treated the unrest as a simple annoyance, even as some estimates put the number of protesting workers at more than 240,000. By the end of February, the Tsar decided he'd had enough and wired his general in Petrograd to put an end to the problem. Troops were called out to disperse the crowds. When soldiers from one of the units opened fire on the crowd, about 40 demonstrators were killed. But the military itself was becoming unreliable. One unit mutinied on the evening of February 26th, and though this mutiny was quickly quashed, troops all over the city rebelled the next day. Many soldiers were unwilling to fire on civilians, so they joined the mutiny as well. The generals couldn't tell which soldiers had mutinied and which were still loyal, so the generals withdrew from the city. Within just a few days, the soldiers of the Petrograd garrison had gone over to what was quickly becoming an all-out revolution. The imperial government ordered the Duma, the legislative assembly, which had been in session, to adjourn until April. With the capital in the hands of the revolutionaries and the city in chaos, the members of the Duma were initially at a loss about what to do. The Duma ignored the Tsar and eventually set up a committee to try to get the Tsar to abandon his autocratic form of government in favor of a constitutional monarchy along the lines of Western European countries. You see, the Duma realized that socialist parties were quickly taking control of the revolution and were planning to establish a Soviet, or Revolutionary Council, in Petrograd. Soviets were beginning to form in other parts of the country as well as in Petrograd. The Tsar was on his way back from the front with troops to put down the insurrection, but the train stations along the route were already in the hands of revolutionaries, and his train was diverted to the Russian city of Pskov. Nicholas had no choice then but to agree to some constitutional changes. But by March 2nd, the situation in Petrograd had changed further. The Duma and the Soviets were now demanding his abdication in favor of his more experienced and popular younger brother, Grand Duke Michael. Michael also refused the crown, however, and in a matter of just a few days in early March 1917, Imperial Russia became a republic. What form the republic would take was yet unclear. Would the government remain in the hands of the Duma, which was largely interested in turning Russia into a European liberal capitalist country? Or would the socialists demand a measure of power as well? Well, the Duma formed a provisional government that was intended to be only temporary until elections could be held. The majority of Marxists in the country, the Mensheviks, who believed that a bourgeois capitalist system had to be in place before any kind of worker revolt could in turn overthrow it, supported the Duma's provisional government. Meanwhile, the provisional government took the unpopular position of continuing the war with Germany and Austria. The new government felt it could simply not ignore the treaties that Russia had entered into under the Tsar, even if they were unpopular. The provisional government assumed, furthermore, that the people would rise up in support of the new government and the war effort, just as the French had done during the French Revolution. But 1917 was not 1789. For one thing, the Russian people were far poorer than the average Frenchman. Besides, the provisional government kept putting off elections, and unrest built up in the countryside as conditions there began to deteriorate. The Bolsheviks, who were still very much in the minority, nevertheless were able to take control of the revolution once Lenin returned to Russia. The only way for Lenin and the Bolsheviks, or Reds, to gain control of the revolution was to outmaneuver the Mensheviks, or Whites. After taking over the government in the autumn of 1917, Lenin moved quickly to get Russia out of the war so that he could turn to the task of a systematic economic transformation. In less than a month after the Bolsheviks took power, Russia agreed to an armistice with Germany and Austria. Lenin then took full control. The landowning classes lost their estates to the peasants. Banking was turned into a state monopoly, and stock dividends stopped being paid. Local Soviets forced the wealthy to hand over their money or face imprisonment. Many of the changes that Lenin put in place were clearly not Bolshevik ideas. The Bolsheviks had championed the elimination of private ownership, but Lenin allowed the peasants to divide up land into millions of small farms rather than the collective state farms most Bolsheviks expected. In other words, Lenin was shrewd. He was willing to compromise on some issues in the near term with the idea that things could be changed as the revolution progressed. Industry was another matter. The Bolsheviks initially set up local Soviets in the factories that would take over management collectively. But Lenin saw that this was inefficient and chaotic, so he put the factories under centralized control and rehired the old managers to run the factories according to instructions from the central government. Now that the Bolsheviks had consolidated power, they also rapidly set about instituting structural changes in the economy. But the revolution would take another 4 years to complete as a bitter civil war broke out due to continuing disagreements between Russia's various socialist parties, most notably between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, and as non-socialists struggled to regain control. This prolonged civil war began in June 1918. Russia also entered into a separate war with Poland over much of the territories of the Ukraine. These would eventually become united with Russia upon the formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in 1922. In order to supply industry and provision the armies, Lenin set Russia on the path of something known as war communism. The purpose of war communism was the subordination of the state to the needs of war. It had several features that, in retrospect, were nothing close to the kind of policies most socialist parties had ever promoted. They included first the nationalization of all industries and the introduction of strict centralized management. This was essentially a continuation of what Lenin had already introduced in Petrograd in late 1917. Second, workers were forbidden to strike, and non-workers were obligated to provide labor services. Third, peasant land was confiscated and redistributed, and agricultural surpluses could be requisitioned from farms. Food and most commodities were rationed in the urban areas. Fourth, private enterprise was banned. Fifth, the state introduced military-style control of the railroads. Sixth, a single-party political system was introduced, with Lenin setting out a program of oppression and murdering his political opponents. This reign of terror was intended to fight any counter-revolution that could threaten the Bolshevik control of the government. As many as 6,300 people were summarily executed in 1918. What prompted these oppressive policies? Well, production in all sectors plummeted following the revolution and Russia's exit from the First World War. The occupation of parts of Russia by the Whites, the term used for Russia's non-communist but still socialist groups, as opposed to the communist Reds, cut off most industrial centers from coal and iron reserves. Due to land and naval blockades, the Bolsheviks had a hard time getting the materials they needed. The Bolsheviks were unable to solve the food crisis that had been one of the reasons that the workers started striking in Petrograd in 1917. Unable to engage in trade, the Russian peasants began reverting to subsistence farming. In the face of continued food shortages, workers left the cities for the countryside in droves, hoping to return to some kind of farming. In these circumstances, the state simply took over the economy. Trade and distribution on Lenin's system of war communism became a state monopoly. The result was a massive increase in state bureaucracy and increased centralization under Bolshevik leadership. But Lenin realized once more that rule by committee was neither practical nor efficient. So Lenin employed managers. Most socialists balked at this because the use of managers diminished the role of workers in industry. Trade unionism and collective management had been a central position of communist parties. Well, by 1920, the war with Poland came to an end, and it was clear that Bolsheviks were firmly in power. But Russia had been thoroughly ruined economically. The industrial output of the country was almost non-existent. Its railroad was in a shambles, and the currency was virtually worthless. People had to resort to barter. In this post-war climate, opposition to Bolshevik policies was rising even among fellow communists. Peasant revolts flared, and socialist parties were beginning to speak out. Finally, in March 1921, Ukrainian sailors in the Russian Navy revolted and demanded that the Bolshevik Party end its exclusive power to rule. The sailors also wanted the controls put in place under war communism to be relaxed. The Bolsheviks ruthlessly put down this revolt. But it had become clear that it was time for Lenin to make changes in policy. The result was Lenin's New Economic Policy, or NEP, the most extraordinary change, and one that suggests that Lenin was conceding that communism wasn't working as planned, was the restoration of some limited private enterprise. This was targeted directly at the peasants, who were a huge part of the population, but who still lived at subsistence levels. Under the new economic policy, peasants were allowed to sell their surpluses at market. This might seem a small concession, but the implications were significant. Allowing a market economy in agricultural produce meant that a money economy would be reintroduced into Russia. Lenin also realized that it meant that factories of consumer goods would have to be given the freedom to sell their goods as well. Now, bear in mind that this freedom applied only to farm surpluses and consumer goods. The state still controlled heavy industry, banking, and foreign trade. But Lenin's changes were a significant departure from the teachings of Karl Marx. Well, the new economic policy allowed Russia to recover somewhat from the worst of the war years. But it was still not clear how communism would operate in an otherwise capitalist world, especially when it seemed that capitalist institutions were required for communism to function. Well, Lenin died in 1924, only a few years after putting the new economic policy in place. With his passing, a power vacuum took place, leading to years of instability as several factions within the Bolshevik Party jockeyed for control. It was Joseph Stalin, a crony of Lenin's, who ultimately was able to eliminate political opposition and consolidate power. But Stalin rejected much of Lenin's economic liberalization in favor of a carefully planned economy. He established the notion of 5-year plans to control production and growth. Stalin's planned economy focused not on markets or profits like the capitalist system, but rather on output goals. Production is what mattered. Often these output goals were put in place with little thought of the costs involved. So they often led to inefficiency and even negative profits. But they did succeed at boosting Soviet industrial output dramatically. The planned economy functioned so differently from the capitalist system of the other industrialized countries that the Depression of the 1930s had a very different character in Russia than it did in Western Europe. For a moment in time, it seemed as though the communist planned economy was able to avoid the kind of shocks that plagued the West. Well, almost.